A battle-scarred Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd stood frozen in a Montana convenience store as an elderly mother placed her son's silver star on the counter, begging for bread. The young cashier could only weep in shock. I'm Wilder, and I've learned in my 55 years that the wild doesn't just live in the woods. It's the storm inside us that only a loyal friend can calm. This is a tale of a debt paid in blood, and a dog who refused to let a hero's mother freeze. Before the hearthfire tells the rest, tell me, where in this wide world are you listening from tonight? Drop your location in the comments, and hit that subscribe button to join our circle of stories. The trail is long, but we walk it together. If you have ever spent a winter in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, you know that the cold here does not simply arrive, it attacks. It is a place of staggering, untouched beauty, but it is also an unforgiving landscape that does not care if you are ready for it. A Montana blizzard comes with a sudden, suffocating blanket of white, and the wind howling through the towering pines sounds like a chorus of ancient ghosts, tearing across the valley, burying the roads, isolating the houses, and freezing the world into absolute stillness. I want you to imagine that cold. The kind of cold that does not just chill the skin, but actively hunts for your bones. The kind of cold that finds the cracks in your walls and the quiet gaps in your spirit. In a small, drafty, weathered cabin on the very edge of the town line, a woman was losing her war against that cold. Her name was Eleanor Vance. She was 78 years old, a woman whose face was a map of a life lived entirely, selflessly, for others. Eleanor was slight, bird-boned and frail, standing barely 5 feet tall. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat, unyielding bun, a testament to a generation that maintained its quiet dignity, no matter how hard the world pushed. Before the war took her son, she had been a woman full of easy, musical laughter. She was the kind of neighbor who baked pies for strangers and remembered everyone's birthday. But grief has a terrible way of eroding a person. When her only son, Caleb, a United States Navy SEAL, came home from the deserts of the Middle East, draped in a flag, the light in Eleanor's eyes had dimmed. The vibrant woman was replaced by a quiet, enduring sorrow. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, holding her head high, even as poverty and isolation slowly tightened their grip around her fragile life. The cabin was freezing. The hearth, which was usually the beating, warm heart of her home, had died late the night before. It left behind nothing but gray, lifeless ashes. She had no wood left to burn. More importantly, she had no money to buy more. Eleanor walked to her refrigerator. Her hands, mapped with blue veins, trembled slightly. It was not just from the bitter chill in the air, but from the bone-deep weakness of a body running on empty. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. She pulled the handle open. Nothing. The refrigerator contained half a jar of old jam, a wilted carrot, and a plastic jug of tap water. She closed the door. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. It was the heavy, suffocating sound of complete abandonment. She walked into her living room, her worn slippers shuffling across the cold wooden floorboards. She stopped in front of a small oak dresser. Her arthritic fingers slowly, painfully pulled open the top drawer. Inside sat a heavy oak shadow box. The wood of the box was polished and pristine, fiercely protected, the only thing in the entire house that had not surrendered to decay. Inside that box rested a piece of metal attached to a ribbon. A silver star, awarded posthumously to Caleb Vance for conspicuous gallantry, for giving his life so that his brothers in arms could live. Eleanor stared at it. She remembered the day the men in their crisp uniforms knocked on her door. She remembered the devastating weight of the metal when they handed it to her. Now, it was the only thing of earthly value she had left. "I am so sorry, my brave boy," she whispered to the empty, freezing room. "But you cannot eat silver. You cannot burn brass and fabric to stay warm." With a trembling hand, she opened the back of the shadow box. To remove the metal felt like a betrayal. It felt like trading away the last piece of Caleb's soul. But the agonizing cramp in her stomach and the numbness in her fingers reminded her of a harsh, inescapable reality. She removed the metal from its velvet bed and slipped it deep into the pocket of her worn, moth-eaten wool coat. She wrapped a faded, frayed scarf around her neck, pushed her feet into a pair of boots that had lost their tread years ago, and stepped out into the howling storm. She began the agonizing, freezing walk toward the town's only convenience store. Miles away, on a treacherous, winding stretch of the icy highway, a beat-up Ford pickup truck was crawling through the whiteout conditions. Behind the wheel was Elias Thorne. Elias was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the Montana rock and then left out in the harsh weather too long. In his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, he possessed the rugged, quiet intensity of a man who has seen entirely too much of the dark. His face was framed by a thick, untamed dark beard, and his eyes, a piercing, stormy blue, were constantly scanning the horizon, constantly searching for threats that were no longer there. Elias was a former Navy SEAL. He was a survivor of the very same ambush that had taken Caleb Vance, and that survival was his greatest, heaviest burden. The guilt of breathing when his brothers did not had completely hollowed him out. He had spent the last 2 years drifting from town to town, living out of his truck, taking odd jobs, and running from the echoes of gunfire and the faces of the men he could not bring home. He was wandering aimlessly, a ghost haunting his own life, completely empty inside. But Elias was not entirely alone. Sitting in the passenger seat, acting as a massive, comforting anchor in the storm of his life, was Koda. Koda was an 85-pound sable German shepherd. He was a certified service dog, but to Elias, he was so much more. He was a lifeline. Koda's ears were sharp and alert, his amber eyes highly intelligent and deeply empathetic. He was specifically trained to detect the invisible, chemical shifts in human biology, the sudden spike in cortisol, the rapid acceleration of a heartbeat, the shallow, jagged breathing that always precedes a severe panic attack. Koda was young, barely 3 years old, but he carried the old soul wisdom of an animal whose entire existence was dedicated to keeping a broken man tethered to the earth. Inside the cab of the truck, the heater was blasting hot air, but Elias was freezing from the inside out. The rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers, the blinding flash of the snow, the total isolation of the road, it was all triggering something terrible. The memories were bleeding through the walls of the present. The dust of the desert, the deafening roar of the ambush, the coppery smell of blood. Elias's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his scarred knuckles turned completely white. His breathing grew jagged and shallow. He was slipping away, falling backward into the nightmare he could never escape. Koda knew. Before Elias even fully realized he was spiraling, the German shepherd shifted his massive weight. The dog let out a soft, low, urgent whine. He reached over the center console and firmly nudged Elias's forearm with his wet nose. When Elias did not immediately respond, his eyes glazed over with panic, Koda took it a step further. He pressed his massive, fur-covered head directly under Elias's hand on the steering wheel, forcing the man to feel his solid, warm, living presence. "I am here," the dog's posture said. "You are here. We are in Montana. You are safe." Elias blinked rapidly, sucking in a sudden, ragged breath of air. The ghosts retreated back into the shadows of his mind. He looked down at the dog, resting a trembling hand on Koda's warm head, letting his fingers sink into the thick sable fur. "Good boy," Elias whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I got it, buddy. I'm okay." The storm was getting worse, the visibility dropping to near zero. Elias knew he had to get off the road before the truck ended up in a ditch. Up ahead, through the swirling white curtain of snow, a neon sign flickered. The local convenience store, a solitary beacon in the endless winter. Elias slowly pulled the truck into the snow-packed parking lot, shifting the gear into park. He left the engine running for heat and leaned back against the headrest, closing his eyes, just trying to breathe, trying to steady the frantic beating of his heart. But Koda did not relax. The German shepherd's ears suddenly pinned forward. He stood up on the passenger seat, his heavy paws planting firmly on the dashboard. He pressed his wet black nose against the cold glass of the window, his amber eyes locked intently on something outside in the blizzard. He let out a sharp, urgent whimper, his tail completely still. Elias opened his eyes and followed the dog's intense gaze through the windshield, peering through the driving snow. There, illuminated briefly by the harsh, flickering neon light of the store, was a fragile figure. An old woman, wrapped in a threadbare coat, her head bowed against the brutal wind. She was shivering violently, clutching her coat pocket tightly as she pushed open the heavy glass door of the convenience store. She walked with the heavy, desperate steps of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Elias did not know her name. He did not know that sitting in her freezing pocket was the silver legacy of a man he had once fought beside. He only knew that Koda was staring at her, locked on to her distress. And Elias knew one thing for certain: Koda was never wrong. The convenience store was a pocket of harsh fluorescent light against the howling Montana blizzard. The bell above the glass door jingled, a fragile sound quickly swallowed by the wind, as Eleanor Vance stepped inside. She moved with the stiff, aching slowness of a woman carrying too much winter in her bones. Behind the checkout counter stood Lily. Lily was 19 years old, a local girl with a constellation of pale freckles across her nose, and a thick mane of auburn hair woven into a tight, practical braid resting over her left shoulder. She was a gentle, soft-hearted soul, the kind of girl who always saved the expired pastries for the stray dogs behind the dumpsters, and spent her shifts dreaming of saving enough money for community college. Her bright, hopeful youth stood in stark contrast to the weary, snow-battered faces of the customers who trudged in from the highway. Eleanor approached Lily's register, her trembling hands slowly placing her meager survival supplies on the black conveyor belt. A single loaf of discounted white bread and 2 dented cans of chicken noodle soup. Lily smiled warmly, her fingers flying over the scanner to ring up the few items. But her smile faltered when she saw Eleanor reach into the pocket of her moth-eaten coat. The old woman did not pull out a worn leather wallet or a handful of crumpled dollar bills. Instead, her arthritic fingers gently laid a heavy, polished oak shadow box on the scuffed counter. The lid was open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was the silver star. The metal caught the harsh overhead light, gleaming with a solemn, sacred weight that seemed to silence the entire room. Eleanor looked up at the young cashier, her pale blue eyes swimming with unshed tears, and offered a smile that held the crushing, quiet agony of a mother's broken heart. "I'm out of money, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the store's refrigerators. Could you hold this as collateral, just until the storm passes and I can figure something out? It belonged to my Caleb." Lily stared at the metal. Her young, innocent mind struggled to process the monumental tragedy sitting next to a loaf of bread. She reached out, her fingers trembling violently as they brushed against the cold, unyielding metal of the star. A sudden, breathless sob escaped her throat. The sheer injustice of it, an old woman trading a hero's legacy for a few days of food, hit the 19-year-old like a physical blow. Tears spilled over Lily's freckled cheeks, dropping silently onto the black surface of the counter. "Ma'am," Lily choked out, her voice breaking, I can't. The machine, it only takes cash or cards. The manager is out of town for the week, and I can't open the till for a trade." Desperate to help, the young girl frantically pulled her own worn fabric purse from under the counter, her hands shaking as she dug through the compartments. She pulled out her own money, but it was just 3 crumpled single-dollar bills, not even enough to cover the soup. Lily looked at Eleanor, completely shattered by her own helplessness, the tears flowing freely as she realized she could not save this woman from the cold. At the very back of the store, standing by the self-serve coffee station, Elias Thorne was trying to remember how to breathe. He was pouring a cup of stale, black coffee, seeking any kind of mundane anchor in the storm of his drifting life. But then, the quiet, trembling voice from the front counter drifted down the aisle. It belonged to my Caleb. The name hit Elias's chest like a sniper's bullet. His massive, scarred hands froze instantly. The styrofoam coffee cup buckled under his sudden iron grip, sending scalding black liquid spilling over his knuckles. But he didn't even feel the burn. He slowly turned his head, looking past the aisles of brightly colored snacks. He saw the frail back of the old woman wrapped in the thin coat. He saw the undeniable gleam of the silver star resting on the counter. In a fraction of a second, the fluorescent lights of the convenience store vanished. The biting Montana cold was replaced by the suffocating, dusty heat of a Middle Eastern desert. The hum of the refrigerators became the deafening, chaotic roar of a Taliban ambush. Elias was no longer a drifter in a winter storm. He was a desperate soldier, screaming a name into a radio, watching the best man he ever knew lay down his life to cover their squad's retreat. Caleb. It was Caleb's mother. The realization was a terrifying, suffocating weight. The survivor's guilt that Elias had been outrunning for 2 years suddenly caught up with him, wrapping its icy fingers around his throat. His chest heaved as a full-blown panic attack seized his nervous system. The flight response, raw and undeniable, screamed at him to run. He took a staggering step backward, his boots sliding on the wet linoleum. He wanted to turn away. He wanted to push through the back exit, disappear into the blizzard, and let the whiteout erase his shame. He could not face her. He could not face the mother of the man who died so he could live. But Elias was not alone. Koda, the 85-pound sable German shepherd, had been standing faithfully at his side. The dog's amber eyes missed nothing. Koda felt the violent tremor shoot through Elias's legs. He smelled the sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline and fierce sweat cutting through the aroma of stale coffee. As Elias took another desperate step backward, attempting to retreat into the shadows and flee the store, Koda moved with lightning speed. The massive canine lunged forward, throwing his muscular body directly behind Elias's knees, physically blocking the soldier's path of retreat. Elias stumbled, looking down at his dog. Koda planted his paws firmly on the linoleum, the fur on his neck bristling slightly. He let out a single, sharp, authoritative bark, a sound that cut through the roaring echoes of gunfire in Elias's head, like a beacon in the fog. Koda did not nudge him toward the door. He stood like a living wall, his intelligent eyes burning with a fierce, grounding demand. He was telling his handler, with every ounce of his loyal spirit, that they were not running away today. The dog pushed his heavy snout against Elias's thigh, forcing the broken soldier to stand his ground, forcing him to look away from the ghosts of his past and focus on the very real, very present tragedy unfolding at the checkout counter. The sharp, authoritative bark of the German Shepherd anchored Elias Thorne back to the scuffed linoleum floor of the convenience store. The deafening, phantom roar of the desert ambush receded, replaced by the hum of the flickering neon lights and the soft, tragic weeping of the teenage cashier. Elias took a long, jagged breath, letting the icy Montana drafts leaking through the window frames clear the smoke from his mind. He looked down at Koda, whose amber eyes were locked on him with a steady, unyielding demand. "We do not run," the dog's posture seemed to say, his heavy body planted firmly across Elias's path of retreat. Elias nodded once, a silent agreement between a broken soldier and his loyal hound. He stepped out from the shadows of the coffee aisle, his heavy boots thudding softly against the floor. As he approached the counter, his towering, broad-shouldered frame seemed to absorb the harsh light of the room. Lily instinctively took a half-step back, her tear-stained, freckled face turning toward this scarred stranger. Eleanor Vance did not move, her frail hands still resting near the open wooden box. Elias reached out. His calloused, weather-beaten fingers, hands that had held weapons and lives, gently touched the cold metal of the silver star. He did not pick it up. Instead, he slowly, respectfully slid the velvet-lined box back across the counter until it rested against Eleanor's worn wool coat. "Put this away, ma'am," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that brooked no argument, yet carried an unexpected, profound gentleness. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a weathered leather wallet, and extracted a sleek credit card, handing it to the stunned 19-year-old behind the register. "Ring it all up. Put her groceries on this." Lily blinked, a fresh wave of tears welling in her eyes, but this time they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She sniffled, nodding frantically as she swiped the card, her hands shaking as she bagged the bread and the dented cans of soup. Eleanor looked up at Elias, her pale blue eyes wide with confusion and a fragile, deeply buried hope. "Young man, I couldn't possibly," she began, her voice trembling like dry leaves in the winter wind. "You don't owe me a thing," Elias interrupted softly, taking the plastic bags from Lily's hands. "It's a bad night to be out walking. My truck has 4-wheel drive and a good heater. Let us give you a ride home." Eleanor looked from the towering man to the massive sable dog sitting perfectly still at his side, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a strange, inexplicable sense of safety. She nodded, offering a small, fragile smile. The Montana blizzard was a living, breathing beast outside the heavy steel doors of Elias's Ford F-250, howling and battering against the windshield, but inside the cab, the heater roared, pumping glorious dry warmth into the small space. Elias gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the treacherous, snow-covered road ahead, but his mind was completely consumed by the woman sitting in the passenger seat. In the faint green glow of the dashboard lights, he could see her profile. He recognized the shape of her jaw, the stubborn set of her chin, but it was her eyes that tore at his soul. They were the exact same shade of pale winter ice. They were Caleb's eyes. Caleb Vance had been a man built of pure, unyielding optimism. He was younger than Elias, lean and wire-strong, with a crooked, easy smile that could disarm a hostile room in seconds. Caleb had been the heart of their SEAL team, a fiercely loyal brother who spoke constantly of the Bitterroot Valley, and the mother he had left behind to protect the world. And now, Elias was sitting beside that very mother. The silence in the cab was deafening, heavier than the storm outside. Elias's conscience raged a violent war within his chest. Every fiber of his being wanted to look over and say her son's name, to tell her that he knew Caleb, that he had fought beside him, that he loved him like a brother. But the suffocating guilt of the survivor paralyzed his tongue. How could he look this fragile, grieving woman in those familiar eyes, and confess that he was the one who came back, that her son had laid down his life in the bloody dust of a foreign land, so that Elias could sit in this warm truck today? The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his lungs, turning his silence into a cowardly shield. He kept his eyes locked on the whiteout conditions, swallowing the truth until it tasted like ash in his mouth. In the cramped space of the truck's cabin, Koda had positioned himself in the middle, his massive body taking up the space between the two front seats. The German Shepherd, ever sensitive to the shifting emotional currents around him, sensed the crushing tension radiating from his handler, but he also sensed the deep, quiet sorrow echoing from the frail woman beside him. Moving with a surprising, deliberate gentleness for an animal of his size, Koda shifted his weight, leaning over the center console to rest his large, heavy, fur-covered chin directly onto Eleanor's lap. He let out a long, soft exhale, his amber eyes looking up at her with pure, unconditional empathy. Eleanor gasped softly, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at the dog, and slowly, her arthritic fingers reached out to stroke the thick, sable fur on his broad head. A tear broke loose, sliding down her wrinkled cheek, catching the dashboard light like a falling diamond. "Oh, you are a beautiful boy, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. She looked over at Elias, her eyes shining in the dim light. "You know, my Caleb, my boy, when he was just a little thing, no higher than my hip, he brought home a stray German Shepherd, called him Buster. That dog used to do this exact same thing. Whenever I was sitting by the fire, missing his father, Buster would just come and lay his big, heavy head right on my knees. Just like this. It's like they know when your heart is hurting." The words hung in the warm air of the cabin, a beautiful, devastating echo of the past. Elias stopped breathing. The mention of Caleb's name from her lips, paired with the image of his loyal dog comforting his fallen brother's mother, was almost more than he could bear. His chest constricted violently. He clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding together as he gripped the steering wheel so hard his forearms trembled and his knuckles turned stark white. He stared blindly into the swirling snow, using every ounce of his military discipline to suppress the raw, jagged sob that threatened to tear its way out of his throat, trapped in a silence he did not know how to break, while his dog did the one thing he couldn't: offer her comfort. The drive back to Eleanor's cabin was a slow, treacherous crawl through a blinding wall of white. The Bitterroot Valley was surrendering entirely to the blizzard, the wind howling down from the peaks like a pack of starved wolves. When Elias finally pulled his battered Ford pickup into the snow-choked driveway, the sight of the house struck a heavy blow to his chest. It was a fragile, weathered structure, its paint peeling like dead bark, the roof sagging under the immense weight of accumulated snow. It looked exactly like a place the world had decided to forget. Elias did not hesitate. He moved with the precise, deliberate efficiency of a man who had spent his life operating in crisis. He gently guided Eleanor through the biting wind and into the freezing living room, helping her into an old, faded armchair. The air inside the cabin was completely stagnant, biting and bitter, carrying the distinct, hollow scent of a hearth that had been cold for far too long. "Stay wrapped up, ma'am," Elias told her, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the draft. "I'm going to get some heat going." He walked back out into the storm, heading to the bed of his truck where he kept a tarp-covered stack of seasoned oak and cedar. He carried armfuls of the dry wood inside, the physical exertion acting as an anchor for his racing mind. Kneeling before the blackened, empty fireplace, Elias went to work. His scarred hands that had held rifles and tourniquets, now carefully arranged the kindling. He struck a match. Within minutes, a tentative orange glow began to push back the oppressive, blue shadows of the room. The wood snapped and popped, and a glorious dry heat began to radiate outward, chasing the frost from the window panes. With the fire established, Elias moved to the kitchen. Eleanor had quietly mentioned that the water had stopped running earlier that morning. Elias knelt under the cramped, dimly lit sink. He found the frozen pipe, a victim of the cabin's poor insulation. Working with a wrench from his truck and a portable heater, he slowly thawed the copper line. There was a profound, quiet satisfaction in the work. For the first time in 2 years, Elias was using his hands to fix something broken, rather than bracing for something to explode. When the water finally sputtered and flowed from the faucet, he stood up, wiping his hands on his denim jeans. But as he turned around, his eyes landed on the small, scratched kitchen table. It was covered in a neat, tragic pile of envelopes. Elias walked over, his jaw setting into a hard line. He didn't mean to pry, but the red ink stamped across the paper was impossible to ignore. Past due, final notice, urgent action required. There were utility bills, property tax warnings, and a mountain of medical debt statements. Elias picked one up, his thumb tracing the embossed logo of a collection agency. A cold, heavy realization washed over him. In the deserts of the Middle East, the enemy had a face. The enemy carried a weapon, wore a uniform, and fought you in the light of day or the chaos of night. But here, in this quiet, snow-buried valley, the enemy was entirely different. The enemy was the absolute, crushing apathy of society. It was the slow, silent strangulation of poverty and the profound isolation of old age. Eleanor Vance had given her only son to her country. Caleb had bled out in the sand so that men like Elias could come home. And in return, the world had left his mother to freeze to death in the dark, threatening to take the very roof from over her head. Elias set the paper down. He looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of the kitchen window. For 2 solid years, he had been running. He had drowned his nights in cheap whiskey and spent his days driving aimlessly from one forgotten town to the next, convinced that if he just kept moving, the survivor's guilt would not be able to catch him. He had convinced himself he was a ghost, unworthy of peace, forever defined by the fact that he had lived while a better man had died. But looking at those bills, something ancient and powerful woke up inside the weary soldier. Running away had never brought him a single night of peace. Hiding in the bottom of a bottle had never silenced the gunfire in his nightmares. He realized, with absolute, sudden clarity, that his mission had not ended in the desert. It had simply relocated. Protecting Eleanor, making sure that Caleb's mother never had to trade a piece of her son's soul for a loaf of bread ever again. This was the duty he was meant to fulfill. This was how he would earn the breath in his lungs. Elias walked quietly back into the living room. The fire was roaring now, filling the space with a rich, golden light. Eleanor had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep in the armchair, her breathing finally slow and steady. Above the fireplace, resting on the wooden mantel, was a framed photograph. Elias stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was Caleb. The photograph showed a young man in his crisp, pristine navy dress uniform. Caleb had a strong, square jaw, a smattering of pale freckles across his nose that military discipline had never quite managed to erase, and bright, piercing eyes that held the reckless, beautiful confidence of a young man who truly believed he was invincible. He was smiling that familiar, crooked smile that Elias had seen 100 times in the barracks. Elias stared at the face of his fallen brother. The grief was there, heavy and sharp. But for the first time, it was not accompanied by the frantic urge to flee. Slowly, almost reverently, Elias lifted the flannel sleeve of his shirt and gently wiped away a thin layer of gray dust that had settled over the glass frame. It was a silent vow, a promise made between 2 soldiers, separated by the veil of death. "I've got the watch now, brother," Elias thought. "I'm not leaving her." He stepped back and looked down at the hearth. Koda had curled his massive 85-pound frame onto the braided rug directly in front of the fire. The German shepherd's sable coat glowed warm in the firelight. Koda looked up at Elias, his highly intelligent amber eyes reading the shift in his handler's soul. The panic was gone. The restless, erratic energy that usually radiated from Elias had settled into a quiet, immovable strength. Koda rested his heavy chin on his front paws and let out a soft, contented sigh. Thump, thump, thump. The dog's thick tail beat a slow, rhythmic tempo against the wooden floorboards. It was not a loud noise, but in a house that had been drowning in absolute silence and sorrow for years, it was a profound sound. It was the sound of a hearth coming back to life. It was the sound of a fractured family, pieced together from broken parts, finally finding peace. The afternoon bled into evening, the pale Montana sun surrendering entirely to the relentless, howling dark. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed. The bitter, stagnant cold that had gripped the walls for days was finally broken, replaced by the deep, radiant warmth of the seasoned oak Elias had brought in. While Eleanor rested in her faded armchair, gathering her strength, Elias sat on the braided rug near the hearth. He pulled his smartphone from his heavy canvas jacket. The cellular signal was weak, a single, fragile bar fighting through the blizzard. But it was enough. He pulled the stack of past due notices from his pocket, the ones he had quietly slipped off the kitchen table earlier. Elias had money. He had years of unspent combat pay and disability checks sitting in an account he rarely touched, primarily because he had believed he didn't deserve a future to spend it on. With methodical precision, his large, calloused thumbs tapped across the glowing screen. He navigated to the collection agency websites, the utility company portals, and the county tax board. One by one, he entered his own banking information. The medical debts from Eleanor's late husband, the crushing heating arrears, the predatory mortgage threats. He paid them all. He watched the digital confirmation screens pop up, erasing the red ink of poverty that had been slowly suffocating Caleb's mother. It was a silent, invisible strike against the apathy of the world, executed not with a rifle, but with a glowing screen in a snowbound cabin. He deleted the browsing history, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and tossed the physical bills into the roaring fire, watching the paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash. The scent of chicken broth and warming bread soon drifted from the small kitchen. Eleanor emerged, moving with a little more color in her cheeks now that the cabin was warm. She carried a worn wooden tray, bearing 2 chipped ceramic bowls of steaming soup, the very soup Elias had paid for at the convenience store. She set the tray on the low coffee table between the armchair and the hearth. "It isn't much, young man," she said, her voice carrying a fragile, melodic warmth that hadn't been there before. "But it will warm your bones. You have done more for an old woman today than I could ever repay." Elias looked at the soup, then up at the photograph of Caleb resting on the mantel. In his mind, he could see Caleb vividly, a young man with bright, piercing eyes, a smattering of freckles across his nose, and a fierce, selfless spirit that always put his brothers first. The guilt Elias had been carrying, a heavy, suffocating stone in his chest, suddenly felt unbearable. He could not sit here, eating her food, basking in the warmth of her fire, while hiding behind the mask of a helpful stranger. The truth demanded the light. Elias set his bowl down untouched. He moved from the rug and lowered himself, dropping to one knee on the hardwood floor, right beside her chair. His massive frame was bowed, his broad shoulders trembling under the weight of a secret he had carried across oceans and continents. "Ma'am?" Elias began, his voice breaking, a raw, gravelly sound scraping through his throat. "My name isn't just Elias, it's Elias Thorne, Petty Officer First Class Elias Thorne." Eleanor went completely still, her hands resting in her lap. Elias couldn't look her in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on the frayed edges of the rug. "I knew Caleb. We were in the same platoon. We were brothers." He swallowed hard, fighting the tears that were burning the backs of his eyes. "He was the best of us. On that night, the night of the ambush in the valley, we were pinned down. I was pinned down. Caleb broke cover. He drew their fire so the rest of the squad could fall back to the extraction point. He gave his life so I could keep mine. And I have spent every single day since then wishing it had been me instead of him. I am so sorry, Mrs. Vance. I am so terribly sorry that I came home, and he didn't." The silence that followed was absolute. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the cabin was the fierce crackling of the oak logs in the fireplace, and the muffled shrieking of the blizzard hurling itself against the window panes. Elias braced himself for the anger. He braced himself for the grief, the accusations, the righteous hatred he felt he deserved from the mother of the man who had died for him. He closed his eyes, waiting for the blow. Instead, he felt a touch. It was not a strike, but a pair of frail, trembling hands gently resting on his broad, shaking shoulders. Eleanor slid off the edge of her armchair and knelt on the floor right in front of him. She reached out and took his scarred face in her small, warm hands, forcing him to lift his head and look into her pale blue eyes. There was no hatred there, only a profound, bottomless ocean of grace. "Oh, my sweet boy," Eleanor whispered, her own tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "Do you think my Caleb would have wanted you to spend your life in the dark? He gave his life for his brothers because he loved you all. He gave you the gift of tomorrow, you surviving, you being right here, right now, in my living room. That is not a sin, Elias. That is my son's greatest legacy." She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling the massive, broken soldier into an embrace. Elias broke. The walls he had built around his heart for 2 years completely shattered. He buried his face in her shoulder and wept, a deep, agonizing, soul-cleansing sob that tore through his entire body. Sensing the massive release of emotion, Koda did not remain on the rug. The loyal German shepherd stepped forward, his amber eyes full of deep canine empathy. Koda pushed his large, sable head right into the space between them. He let out a soft, comforting whine, and began to gently lick the tears streaming down Elias's cheek. The dog leaned his heavy body against Elias's side, offering the solid, unwavering weight of his presence. Eleanor reached out one hand and stroked Koda's ears, smiling through her tears as the dog completed their circle. The storm raged outside, burying the Bitterroot Valley in ice and darkness, but inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and hot. The crackling of the wood drowned out the howling wind. In the warmth of that small room, beneath the smiling photograph of a fallen hero, a deep, festering wound was finally stitched closed. The bitter grip of the Montana winter does not surrender easily, but when it finally breaks, the Bitterroot Valley is reborn in a chorus of rushing water and vibrant green. Months had passed since the howling blizzard nearly claimed the life of an old woman, and the soul of a broken soldier. Now, the heavy, suffocating snowdrifts were melting away, feeding the rivers that carved rapidly through the valleys. The air no longer smelled of frost and desperate wood smoke. It carried the sweet, earthy scent of damp pine needles, rich soil, and blooming wildflowers. Eleanor Vance's cabin, which had once looked like a fragile, dying thing ready to collapse under the weight of the snow, stood tall and proud in the golden morning light. The peeling paint had been scraped away and replaced with a warm, cheerful coat of pale yellow. The sagging roof had been meticulously repaired, and the front porch, once dangerously rotten, was now framed by sturdy, freshly cut cedar pillars. This transformation was the quiet, steady work of a man who had finally stopped running. Elias Thorne had parked his beat-up Ford pickup truck for good. He was no longer a ghost drifting from town to town, haunting the highways to escape the echoes of a distant desert war. He had unpacked his tools, sharpened his chisels, and decided to build a life right here in the shadow of the mountains. Elias had quickly become the town's most reliable carpenter, a silent giant with scarred hands who could fix anything that was broken. He didn't just rebuild Eleanor's home. He reached out to the surrounding community, finding purpose in the act of mending rather than destroying. He spent his afternoons repairing the weather-beaten roof of the local community center and fixing the notoriously stubborn front door of the convenience store. Lily, the 19-year-old cashier with the constellation of pale freckles across her nose and the thick auburn braid resting over her shoulder, often watched him work with a bright, grateful smile. Lily was a tender-hearted, innocent girl, carrying the dreams of attending a community college, and she had never forgotten the dark winter night Elias stepped out of the shadows to save the old woman's silver star. When Elias built her a custom oak bookshelf for her future dorm room, charging her only a cup of black coffee in return, the young girl wept again, this time out of pure, overwhelming joy. Elias's demons, the relentless grip of his PTSD, had not magically vanished. There were still nights when a sudden, loud noise in the valley would make his broad shoulders flinch, and the shadows in his mind would blindly reach for him. But the darkness no longer swallowed him whole. Whenever the ghosts of the battlefield crept too close, Koda was there. The 85-pound sable German shepherd would instantly press his solid, warm weight against Elias's leg, anchoring him to the present, reminding him that he was safe, that he was home, and that he was deeply needed by a family that relied on him. Inside the newly insulated walls of the cabin, the heavy silence of grief had been entirely replaced by the comforting hum of a shared life. Above the hearth, which now held a cheerful, crackling springtime fire just to chase away the crisp morning chill, the mantel had been rearranged. Caleb's photograph still held a place of honor, but it was no longer a lonely, desperate shrine to a fallen boy. Right next to it, the silver star was beautifully displayed inside a pristine, polished glass case that Elias had carved by hand, preserving the legacy with the utmost respect. And sitting right beside the medal was a brand new photograph, enclosed in a simple wooden frame. It was a picture taken just a few weeks prior, during the first true thaw of the season. In the photo, Eleanor was smiling brightly, a genuine, musical laugh captured in time, her frail arm wrapped tightly around Elias's massive waist. Elias was looking directly at the camera, his piercing blue eyes clear and at peace, the heavy burden of survivor's guilt finally lifted from his shoulders. And sitting proudly right in the center of the two humans was Koda, his tongue lolling out in a happy canine grin. It was a portrait of a family forged not by blood, but by an incredible, defiant love that had survived the absolute worst the world had to offer. On this particular, sun-drenched morning, the Bitterroot Valley was humming with life. Eleanor Vance sat comfortably in a beautifully restored wooden rocking chair on her sturdy new front porch. The rhythmic creak of the chair against the cedar floorboards was a soothing, metronomic sound. In her lap, her hands moved nimbly, knitting a bright sky-blue scarf with yarn as soft as a cloud. She hummed an old, sweet melody, pausing occasionally to sip from a mug of warm tea, her heart completely full. A few yards away, in the lush, emerald-green yard, Elias was swinging a heavy steel axe, splitting firewood for the next winter. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, of the axe biting into the logs echoed across the property, a sound of preparation, safety, and permanence. He wore a simple white t-shirt, his sleeves rolled up, the morning sun warming his scarred arms. And darting wildly across the fresh, dew-kissed grass was Koda. The highly trained, incredibly disciplined service dog had completely abandoned his serious duties for the morning. He was playfully chasing a small, bright yellow spring butterfly that fluttered just out of his reach. Koda bounded through the wildflowers, letting out a series of sharp, joyful barks, his bushy tail wagging so frantically that his entire hindquarters shook with delight. Elias paused, resting the head of the axe on a log, and wiped the sweat from his brow. He looked at Koda's ridiculous antics, then looked up at the porch, where Eleanor was smiling down at them. Elias Thorne smiled back, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The war was finally over. They were home. Well, my friends, as the embers burn low and the stars come out over the Bitterroot Valley, I want you to take a moment and think about what Eleanor, Elias, and Koda really found out there in the snow. They did not just survive a winter storm. They survived the winters inside their own minds. We all carry scars. We all have days when the cold feels like it might just win. We hide our grief in small wooden boxes, and we run from our past down empty highways. But this story tells us that we do not have to carry that weight alone. In our daily lives, we might not face a literal blizzard or carry the heavy guilt of a battlefield, but we all know what it means to feel isolated. Sometimes, all it takes to thaw a frozen heart is a gentle nudge from a loyal dog, or the courage to step out of the shadows and say, "I am here to help." Love does not always come from the places we expect. Sometimes it comes from a stranger in a convenience store, or a four-legged friend who simply refuses to let us give up. We only need to open our eyes and our hearts to the signs around us. If this story brought a little warmth to your spirit today, please share it with someone who might be walking through their own winter right now. Leave a comment down below and let me know your thoughts, and please subscribe to the channel so we can share many more nights around this campfire. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may He always guide you to safe harbors. If you believe in the healing power of compassion and the unwavering loyalty of a good dog, drop an amen in the comments below. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright and your hearts open to the wild.